Let me start by saying, who here has heard about the expression America's best idea? And given the subject tonight, I'm not even going to ask, but you know what it's referring to, right? National parks, supposedly. But you know, what people are less sure about is where America's best idea actually might have come from, and how did it come about. And it may or may not be the best idea. I think that's a bit of an overstatement. It sort of smacks of exceptionalism. But it is an expression that also overstates the importance of the national park system, and at the same time somehow understates it, which is peculiar. But perhaps the essential observation Rolf and I are here to discuss with you tonight, and what this book is about, is that the national park idea is part of the broader public park idea. That is urban, regional, and national parks, state, national, all public parks. And that is at least a best idea. And if there's a best idea to be discussed here tonight, it's really that. The idea of a separate national park idea is what we're going to be talking about, and whether that actually makes any sense at all, or whether that's sort of a fabrication of sort of early 20th century mythologies. So public parks in the United States and everything that they have meant, you know, the aspirations that people have had for them. You know, if we consider the broader movement to create parks in the United States generally, we can recognize the origin of what we might call today sustainable urbanism, right? Landscape urbanism. You can use the phrase that Olmsted did, landscape architecture, to refer to it. And if we're thinking in those terms, that the idea of creating, if we're talking about the origins of efforts to create, to some degree, a more just and sustainable form for society through working with the landscape, through working with natural processes and systems, not against them, if we're thinking about that as the best idea, then maybe it is. It's an idea that is very relevant today, you know, that addresses the most pressing issues that you are going to go out and face as professionals. It's an issue of global significance, and it's one of and so if we're talking about the origins of that idea, then I will accept maybe it is America's best idea, although that's usually not what people mean when they talk about national parks being America's best idea. You know, creating a more just and verdant world, right? That's how public radio puts it. Sort of general and overwhelmingly positive aspiration. All right. So this is a book about the origins and significance of not just national parks in the U.S., but really parks generically, and where that came from and how important they are. But usually in discussing the national park idea, people are leaving out a lot of that story. I mean, what was that idea really? Where did it come from? Origin stories can be important, and the National Park Service has its share. And they tell a tale of where we came from, and therefore to some degree who we are, what we should be doing in the case of the national park system, how we should manage it, how we should think about it, and maybe who should be visiting it, and what it should mean to them when they do. So let's consider what the traditional origin tales for the national parks in the United States are. Two campfire tales I'll briefly go through here. Campfire 1, 1870, Yellowstone Plateau, the Washburn Expedition. So it's a group of basically businessmen, explorers, operatives of the Northern Pacific Railroad, and others who are exploring the Yellowstone Plateau. And supposedly in 1870 there's a campfire, and they spontaneously come up with the idea, this should be a national park. And that's the story that the Park Service has used since the early 20th century and really up till the 1980s. And there's only one problem with it, that it's complete fabrication. It just didn't happen. And actually, we've known that since at least the 1960s. I think people had their suspicions earlier, but by the 1960s, Aubrey Haynes, the great Yellowstone historian, had really made the case, and there was no excuse after that. The person who made it up was N.P. Langford, who in fact was an operative of the Northern Pacific Railroad. He worked for Jay Cooke. You know who Jay Cooke was? You know, in an era of rapacious, corrupt capitalists in the 19th century, he set the standard. He set the bar. Working for the Northern Pacific Railroad. So that story had to go by the 1980s, 90s, although if I had asked you where did the national park idea come from, how many of you would have said a campfire in Yellowstone? It's still pretty prevalent sort of mythology. Anyway, the Park Service really moved on to another campfire story. And this one at least did take place in 1903. Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir camped out on Glacier Point in Yosemite and had a very good time. And they talked about taking Yosemite Valley and making it part of the larger national park. It was a state park at that time, making it part of the larger national park around it. Now, neither came up with the national park idea, neither came up with the idea of a national park service. In fact, in 1864, when the Yosemite Grant was made by Congress, which is arguably the first national park, Teddy Roosevelt was a small child, and John Muir was still working in a factory in Indiana. And so neither one of them had anything to do with what we're talking about tonight, but this is a very, now if I had asked you where the national parks came from, how many of you would have said Teddy Roosevelt, for example? Yeah, a lot of people. Because this is still now the current sort of origin myth that the Park Service, especially around its 2016 centennial, perpetuates. So the first campfire tale was very important to these guys, the early 20th century National Park Service, but today it's this. It's the campfire in 1903 at Yosemite. So campfire tales seem to be very important stories for how we think about national parks. And they're origin stories, and they matter, and they are still with us. National parks it reinforces an idea of national parks that they are essentially pristine western landscapes, that they are the result of what has been called a virgin birth, that they're free of all historical context and conflict. And there's just this wonderful idea that occurs in the minds of a few wonderful people, and for once, the United States gets it right? Good triumphs over greed, and we do something good for a change. And this world of mostly white, middle-class, automotive tourists, it's a very 20th century idea. It's based on improved highways. After 1918, the federal government is subsidizing, and state government are subsidizing improved highways, which we see on the right, the Park-to-Park Highway, and it's based on affordable cars. And that's sort of the idea of the National Park Service and the national park image that's being created in the early 20th century and really has persisted through campfire tales, if not one, then the other, about how the national park sort of sprung into existence. We should note the period in which the first campfire story in particular was popularized. A lot of mythologies were being created in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in the United States, and a lot of them were about race. This period of reconciliation between white Northerners and white Southerners who agreed to put the violence of the Civil War behind them. And it's a period when the Old South was being sentimentalized through film and books. Even the Ku Klux Klan was being rehabilitated as not that bad. And it was a time when segregation was being systemically applied through Jim Crow laws. For example, the Lincoln Memorial, and Rolf has commented on the irony of this, but the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 is being dedicated with segregated seatings, right? So there's this amazing irony there, but in fact many national parks in southern states and many state parks were also segregated at this time. So the Jim Crow era and the mythologies that are being created then, the campfire story is part of that, and we'll try to talk a little bit about how we see that. Rolf will be talking more about some of that historical context. But what was the best idea then? Where did it come from? Well, if you know me at all, no surprise seeing a comparison like this. What we're presenting in this book is not really, however, a new mythology. And I'd like to emphasize that I'm not trying to replace one myth with another one. What we're trying to do is provide historical context for how the Yosemite Grant was made in 1864 by Congress, and Rolf will go into more detail of that context and that history. And by the way, 1864 Yosemite is the first national park because it's the first time Congress acts to make a national park, right? It becomes a state park because California exists. I know everyone is going to say, no, it's Yellowstone in 1872, and that's true also because Wyoming didn't exist in 1872 as a state, so they kept it under federal ownership. Rolf, perhaps you can clear that up when you come up. but I have to anticipate some of the questions that I know are going to come at us. So we're both inspired, by the way, by a letter from Sarah Shaw. This is an 1861 letter that Sarah Shaw wrote to Frederick Law Olmsted. And I think this quote just captures this amazing identification between the ongoing construction of Central Park in 1861, the movement to abolish slavery, and the remaking of the federal government. In other words, it's not just about civil war, it's about remaking the government into a new form that will be different from the federal government that allowed slavery to exist so long. The remaking of the republic, all of these things that she sees coming out of the Civil War, the cauldron of the Civil War, which had begun just a few months earlier. And of course, her son, who also we have a picture of here, Robert Gould Shaw, would be killed 2 years later in South Carolina at the front, along with about 100 black troops. And so these were people who were very committed. These were people who were committed to the most important causes of the day. And Central Park is in there. We think that's very interesting. It's during this tumultuous period that the idea of the public park, both municipal and national, becomes established as a new public institution in the United States, in both the country's largest city and in the remote Sierra Nevada. When Congress makes the Yosemite grant in 1864, both these public parks embodied many of the values and the aspirations that Olmsted and Sarah Shaw and many others held for what the remade republic could be, in contrast to what it had been. Yes, in dramatically different settings, as we see here, dramatically different circumstances. These are very different places. But in our book, we're really examining what both Central Park and Yosemite Valley had in common without ignoring those differences. And first is their purpose. Well, first, I guess, is their date, right? 1864, the Civil War is ongoing, Central Park is still under construction, and the Yosemite grant is made. First is the fact that this is all happening at the same time. Another thing they have in common, of course, is Olmsted is living in California in 1864, and he's asked to write the Yosemite Report, which he does in 1865, and he's the co-designer of Central Park. So there's person and there's date, but in these different settings, there are some really more important things that these two places have in common. And first is their purpose, broadly speaking. And this one may be hard for some of you to latch onto, because you might think, oh no, these places must have different purposes. But as the purpose of these places was described and understood then in the 19th century, which might not be how we characterize it now, both were acquired and developed for the general public, however we're going to define that, I realize it's a problematic term, to enjoy the benefits of experiences of landscape beauty that otherwise would not be readily available to them. Now that sounds elitist or superficial now if we talk about landscape beauty, but these benefits were considered real, they were considered necessary for individual and general public health, both physical and emotional. Therefore, it was a duty of responsible government to make sure that everyone, again in quotation marks, could have these benefits, because otherwise the privileged few would enjoy them and even monopolize them to the detriment of everybody else. That's the rhetoric of the American Park movement. That's what Olmsted is writing in 1865, and it's not just about Yosemite, it's about parks generally. And of course, it isn't everyone. You know, the people who are being dispossessed and evicted to create these places, for example, would disagree. Rolf is going to address this also in just a moment. But I'd just like to point out that dispossession was being done in what was called public interest, right? Public interest doctrine. That's what justifies the use of eminent domain, at least in the United States, because you can't infringe on people and their property interests unless there is a identified public interest. What gets that? You know, what typically is a public interest? You know, a road, a dam, a water supply system, the infrastructure that's necessary for the well-being of society gets that kind of recognition, and eminent domain is often used to implement those public projects, right? Well, Olmsted is squarely putting parks in that category. They are necessary for human well-being, and therefore they are public health infrastructure, just like roads and dams. So I just wanted to mention that. So purpose. Also, these places share common meanings. They both emerged out of the conflict, the activism, and the rhetoric of the 1850s and 60s to embody the aspirations of a remade nation. What aspirations? A nation, a republic without enslaved people, for example, one that preserved the Union and allowed it to assume a better form, a republic that, if it was still very imperfect, at least was moving toward the still unattained ideals that it had been founded on. This was the ideology of Lincoln, right? The ideology of the new Republican Party. And this may be our main point. Also, the new institution of the public park emerged at this time because of the war and all the social upheaval around it, not in spite of it. That is one of our main points, isn't it, Rolf? I think so. You know, historians have traditionally said, oh, look, they made the Yosemite grant even though there was a civil war. What a remarkable thing. You know, they must have been distracted by the war and they snuck it through. No. And Rolf will talk more about this. So this is absolutely bedrock Republican ideology in 1864, and it's part of a wartime legislative agenda. Historians have also noted that many public institutions came out of this period and a reforged national identity. If anyone's seen the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War, right? You know, the whole idea of the United States changes and is referred to differently. All these new public institutions, including the military, and among others, came out of this period of conflict with a new sense of identity. And when we see the national park together with the urban park as one of these new institutions, as part of a foundation of new national identity, then we begin to answer the question, why do these parks figure so largely in national consciousness? Because they're part of that wartime and post-wartime reforging of national identity. There was a real question, though, whether a Republican form of government could successfully create places like Central Park. In Europe, urban parks had been mostly former aristocratic holdings, gradually open to the public. Here they would not be. They would have to be made by our own governments, our own often chaotic governments, right? People expected the results to be chaotic. Public landscapes would be taken over by mobs and would still be, because that's what was associated with the Republican government, right? Remember, 1848, all of those Republican revolutions in Europe that are violently suppressed by monarchists. Remember, the South essentially was saying the same thing. You know, Republican form of government is chaotic, and we're going to abandon that experiment and simply give up on it, on the idea of the American Republic. So this idea that a republic could engage in major public works and could remake itself as necessary was actually a fairly radical idea. And the creation of a great public park in the largest city of America, of the American Republic in 1858 was in fact a radical act at the time. This was a northern vision of the Republic's future, increasingly urban, industrial, and diverse cities. Could those cities be healthful or even survivable? If they were not, then the northern vision of the nation, which a lot of people were engaged in fighting and dying for, was untenable. The image of unhealthy, chaotic, ungovernable northern cities was great propaganda for the South, you know, the great cliche. You know, the immigrants in your cities are worse off than the enslaved people on our plantations. Images like this one, which were popular, of a beautiful public park with all these people, all this activity, were a direct rebuttal. The popular success of Central Park was proof that the northern vision for the future of the Republic was tenable, and this was not a society drifting into chaos and dysfunction. It could do this. It was, as Calvert Vaux said, the big artwork of the Republic, or as this quotation I have here says from the Atlantic Monthly, it was nothing less than a profoundly effective defense of and vindication of self-government. And I also wanted to mention that this idea of experiencing natural beauty or landscape beauty is not as elitist or as dated as it may sound. It is being expressed in aesthetic terms, but is it really so different from what we talk about now when we talk about experiencing nature or biophilia or simply the need for some contact with the natural world in order to maintain physical and emotional health. It's really the same thing. We put it in terms like nature deficit disorder, and social science seems to be confirming this kind of observation over the last 30 years, let's say. And in fact, it's what Olmsted is asserting in 1865 in his Yosemite Report as a basis for the American park movement and as a justification for governments to be involved in making parks. But whatever the language or terms used, this idea was very important to Olmsted, and he really, he wasn't, you know, he was very progressive for his day, although his attitudes are subject to criticism by our standards now. sometimes. But what he was really interested in is the idea that people like this, and these are, of course, William Cullen Bryant and Thomas Cole, great New York. William Cullen Bryant was one of the major backers of Central Park, for example, could go to the Catskills in the summers. And the rich could own estates. And only the rich would have those experiences unless public parks were created. And therefore, they would be the only ones to benefit from the necessary benefits of contact and enjoyment and appreciation of the natural world, because those benefits would be monopolized by the few. That should be something that resonates today, right? He's saying it needs to be for everyone. Now, it isn't everyone in 1864, no, but it's a lot more than it would have been. And the idea that it is for everyone is a seed that is planted. It's a standard that is being established. So when Olmsted finds himself in Mariposa, California, near Yosemite Valley in 1864, it's not hard to imagine why the State Park Commission now in California, who was created in order to receive the Yosemite grant from the federal government and make the place into a park, it's easy to see why they would say his experience, here he is an experienced park maker, park planner, park designer. This guy Olmsted, he just finished Central Park. Now he happens to be living next to Yosemite Valley. It's easy to see why Olmsted's ideas and his experience, and of course his proximity, all would have been very tempting for the Yosemite State Park Commission. Of course, they hire him right away to chair the commission and to write the report that he publishes in 1865. And the purpose of the new park at Yosemite and the justifications for government to act in making it, as Olmsted described them, were entirely consistent with what he had described about Central Park just a few years earlier, really contemporary too. And these two great icons of the American landscape on either coast have some very important things in common that transcend their differences. These are some of them. I've probably shown this slide to some of you before, but these are just my own extractions from the 1865 Yosemite Report. You can make your own. You could paraphrase, you could come up with your own conclusions about what's most important in that report. I would consider this an intellectual framework for a national park system, and more importantly, for an American park movement generally, that would see parks created at every level of government, from towns and cities to regions, and yes, the federal level. And what I always ask people is, do you believe any of this? Because there are some things that are easy to believe here or that we readily ascribe to. Some things we're not so anxious to, at least as far as they are reflected in government. But we can come back to this if you want. I will end by saying Olmsted, this is another quote from Olmsted about park making in 1893. This is just shortly before he will retire and sort of disappear from the public scene. He's talking to Charles Eliot, his most important apprentice, who would in fact die in 3 years. So it's a very sad letter in a way. But what he's saying is here, I know exactly what's going on. We started with Central Park. Yeah, that was great. And now we're working on the regional parks around Boston. And this is the way it's going to go right across the continent. And you guys, he's talking to his stepson and Charles Eliot, you guys are going to be the ones to do it. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. Eliot died of meningitis as still a very young man. And J.C. Olmsted did a lot of park systems. But where it really happens is in the National Park Service after 1916, where landscape architecture, landscape architectural design, and parking making in what I would call the Fairstead School, or the Olmstedian tradition, becomes the norm. So I will end there and I'll turn over to Rolf, because these are important ideas. No, don't applaud because Rolf hasn't come yet. These are important ideas, but Rolf is going to talk more about where they came from.
So I'm the context guy, I guess. According to Ethan, well, I'll provide a little bit more context to the story. You all know that Frederick Law Olmsted was, at first, a well-traveled chronicler of Southern society and slavery. That's where he really made his name. He was also very active in the Civil War, and he was, as Ethan mentioned, he ran, or as executive director of something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, provided medical relief to Union soldiers, wounded Union soldiers. But he was a peripatetic individual, and just to give you one example, during this service with the Sanitary Commission, he was still going up to Central Park to work with Calvert Vaux on the expansion of the park northward. He was writing editorials on war policy for the New York Times, and he was writing legislation for Reconstruction. And when they, the story is that he was surviving on pickles and black coffee at the time, it could be understood. This was a very, this is a very driven guy. And I think it's important to realize that his strong views on human improvement, particularly marked by his steadfast opposition to human slavery, were his North Star for most of his early life. When he was writing for the New York Times, he reported back, and I quote, that slavery was the greatest sin and shame on any nation or people on God's earth. And it was the duty of every man in the world to oppose slavery, to weaken it, and to destroy it. And in his opinion, there was no greater impediment to the nation's progress than slavery. So this was the context of Olmsted's sort of early development when he's working on Central Park and other things. In fact, the title of his famous compendium book on the South, which is still read today, and there's images of the Cotton Kingdom on the far left of your screen, is actually a play on the title or a reference to a speech that Senator John Hammond of South Carolina infamously gave on the floor of the United States Senate, where Hammond said, "The absolute economic power of cotton, quote, could bring the whole world to our feet." That power was exercised by pro-slavery politicians in Washington before the Civil War. And they were successful in blocking all sorts of legislation, including land grants for education, for transportation, for homesteading. They were content with a relatively weak central government with very limited responsibility. A government that would deliver the U.S. mail, protect settlers on the frontier, and run down fugitive slaves. And they preferred to finance that government, that very anemic government, through the sale of public lands in lieu of personal taxes. They didn't want to tax anyone. They just wanted to sell whatever land that was they controlled, most of it taken from Native Americans, I might add. Thus avoiding taxation on the enormous wealth that had been accumulated through enslaved labor. Of course, once the Civil War broke out, that was all basically turned on its head. By its second year, the war had become, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, a remorseless and revolutionary struggle. Olmsted, meanwhile, clearly understood what was going on, and in 1861, in the New York Times, he wrote that black resistance and self-emancipation in large numbers would hollow out the Confederacy and accelerate its collapse. And this slide on the right is just an illustration of the time of fugitive slaves, or in this case, freed people, seeking sanctuary behind Union lines, wherever they presented themselves. It was an opportunity to resist, to stop labor, and to seek freedom. And by the end of the war, about 500,000 people exercised this resistance and basically left for Union lines. This great movement of freed people and their new alliance with the federal government, which had previously been enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, so you really had to do a mental somersault, a turnaround. Now there was an alliance. The federal government was on their side. The United States Army was on their side. And this enormous migration of people put great pressure on the Lincoln administration to accelerate a policy of general emancipation. Now, at this point, the Republicans had an absolute majority in Congress. All the Southern Democrats had left town once the Confederacy seceded, and it became clear by the second year of the war there would be no negotiated settlement that would return the United States to its status quo. Rapid changes then began to happen. In the summer and spring of 1862, we're talking about a period of 5 months. 5 months. Congress and the Lincoln administration basically expanded the scope and duties of the national government to an unprecedented level. And they fundamentally began to remake the republic. They sought to build a more activist republic, focused on improvements that would now serve a much larger body of people. Within that period of time, from March to July of 1862, legislation was passed for a national banking and revenue system, taxation, new grants for public education, transportation, and homesteading, the creation of the Department of Agriculture, and the capstone to this, what some historians have referred to, the Second American Revolution, was the congressional authorization for black soldiers to be recruited into the United States Army, followed rather quickly by the release of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, all within this 5-month period. When you think about the pace of congressional legislation today, it's sort of mind-boggling. But taken as a whole, these measures affirm the efficacy and value of the Republican government that Ethan was referring to, and it made the case why it was worth fighting for. In 1864, Congress granted, as Ethan has described, Yosemite Valley to the state of California to create a public park. It did so, as Olmsted declared, as a trust to the entire nation. And when people ask, well, wasn't Yosemite just a state park? Well, Olmsted, I think, as a chronicler in the Yosemite Report, a chronicler of history, makes this very clear. It was in trust for the entire nation. The act was another wartime land grant. It was modest, but it turned out to be a consequential part of a wave of wartime legislation that was, as Ethan said, was passed not in spite of the war, but because of the war. Now, for many years, we've had colleagues, historians, who've been at a loss to explain the Yosemite Act. As Ethan said, they considered its wartime passage an anomaly. Nothing like this had happened before, so it was just unexplainable. Or it was just a mystery. So what they couldn't comprehend, why would Congress, in the midst of the war, in its moment of great crisis, take time out to consider this small, relatively small, 800-acre grant for Yosemite Valley? Quite to the contrary, Ethan and I placed the Yosemite Act squarely in this larger framework of wartime reform. In fact, as Lincoln believed, if an insurrection could interfere with the functioning and continuity of constitutional government, I quote, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. Now, when Olmsted was asked to draft a report on the future management of Yosemite Valley as a public park, he used the opportunity to try to explain the larger meaning and significance, but in a global context. And in this slide, I included an image of something, and it may be hard to read, just even the title is called Tentative List. It's a list, the Tentative List is a list of places that are eligible for World Heritage status. That means there are not of local, national, but of international, global significance. And there are almost, I believe, a couple of thousand sites now listed on the World Heritage List. It's an international convention. And so the National Park Service has put together a recommendation for potential future additions to this World Heritage Convention, and they have recommended for possible consideration Central Park, as well they might. Ethan and I were on a telephone conversation, or actually a Zoom call a little bit earlier this week, where we suggested to the National Park Service that their justification should be expanded. This was more than an importance to the urban parks movement. This was about the very concept, as Ethan described, of a public park ideology and the critical role of a Republican government as it played out at Central Park and in the Sierra Nevada and Yosemite Valley in the context of the global struggle between democratic ideals and aristocratic privilege. And this is an international point of view. And Olmsted, in fact, was very explicit in the Yosemite Report. He quoted, he said, both the New World and the Old World should be warned about the private monopolization of these great scenic landscapes. This should be stopped. They shouldn't be privatized. And he argued for equitable access. The report also offered Olmsted a singular opportunity, an unusual opportunity for him to share an aspirational vision for a reconstructed post-war nation. Because this is Olmsted as the historian. This is being written almost on the cusp of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. You have to sort of put it in that context. The war had gone on for 4 bitter, long years, and he's beginning to think about what the country's going to be like coming out of the war. It had to be a different country very different that went into the war. It had to fundamentally change to acknowledge and understand the sacrifice that had occurred. And in this new country, these great public parks were going to become keystone institutions of a remade republic. He affirmed every person's entitlement to enjoy the nation's most spectacular landscapes, as Ethan has described. And in the process, he framed the intellectual foundation for what was to become a national system of parks, our national park system. And you know, the establishment of government, you can read it, of great public grounds for the free enjoyment of the people is justified as a political duty. And he placed this duty on the same grounds, on the same basis of support for all the other major duties of government. This was no less significant. And I have to say, we need to be very clear about that. The goal for the free enjoyment of the people was not an aspiration that was fully realized for all people at that time, and still even today. Not all people who were displaced from their homes, and not for many who found the parks either too distant to reach or who were, in fact, discriminated against when they tried to use them. Indigenous people, of course, were never included in Lincoln's new birth of freedom, as they were forced out of ancestral lands that were repurposed to, in fact, advance some of these Republican land reforms. Early writers who describe Yosemite Valley as untrammeled wild nature willfully overlook countless generations of human occupation. Tragically, the Miwok people, who had made Yosemite Valley their home for thousands of years, suffered violence and dispossession when the valley was, in fact, invaded by California militiamen back in 1851 and incorporated into the public domain more than a decade before the park's creation. And as we acknowledge the significance of the Yosemite Report, we also have to acknowledge the enduring connection Indigenous people have with Yosemite and other national parks as well, and recognize the importance of presenting all aspects of this complex history. Now, some of you may ask about, Ethan referred to it, Yellowstone National Park. It was called the first national park, coming along in 1872. But it was not inspired by a fictional campfire confessional. So how did it come about? Part of the answer is that Yosemite, in fact, was a template for Yellowstone. And part of the answer lies in examining the larger context of Yellowstone's authorization in 1872. What was happening in the early 1870s in the United States? Reconstruction, or at least an attempt at reconstruction. It's just 7 years after the Civil War. And we make the case in our book, in fact, that the Yellowstone Act in 1872 was concurrent with the rising tide of federal authority I referred to, a byproduct of the war. This rising tide was further strengthened, in fact, by congressional intervention and efforts to enforce Southern Reconstruction, and the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And the slide on the left are black men voting for the first time in the South under the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed them the right to vote at the time. As Ethan referred to, since Wyoming and Montana were in fact territories and not states, the option of placing Yellowstone under state administration was in fact foreclosed. Okay. But Congress was predisposed, in any case, to create a national park under federal rather than state or territorial jurisdiction. The designation of a national park in the era of Reconstruction was consistent with public expectation of their government. Our book, in fact, makes the case that if the Yosemite grant in 1864 had been proposed just a few years earlier, say in 1860, in a pre-war Congress, while the country was still held back by slavery and its small government ideology, the park in Yosemite would have no doubt shared the same fate as all other Republican initiatives. Without a Union victory, ultimately, aided by the mobilization of almost 200,000 black soldiers, legislation for Yosemite, and for that matter, Yellowstone, and the early national parks that followed might never have been, in fact, enacted. However, the Yosemite Report was never forgotten. Its influence on national parks lived on through Olmsted's son and namesake, who drafted key provisions of the 1916 Act creating the National Park Service. The goals and purposes of national parks that Olmsted Jr. so famously described were based on many of the ideas his father had advocated almost 50 years earlier. Some of you will sort of recognize the general statement of purpose that Olmsted contributed to the Organic Act, the Creation Act of the National Park Service. So why do we deal with this today? Why deal with it now? Our book makes the case that it is well overdue to tell a refreshed and more inclusive history and pursue it with an ever wider context that sheds new light not just on past events, but on our present condition. Though the reforms that accompanied the Yosemite legislation were imperfect and incomplete, it significantly broadened people's relationship to their government and raised the expectation of government's role in improving public life and expanding and protecting the rights of all Americans. Of course, this expectation was contested then and is still contested to this very day. So the 1865 Yosemite Report is still useful to us as a timeless appeal for equitable access to parks and a powerful affirmation of government's immutable responsibility for the creation and stewardship of public parks now and forever. Thank you.